Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, and I'm moderating the third YouTube session of the sixth fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. So through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 14 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project, to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking, as well as help us reveal the first mystery celebrity male role model portrait in our Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign. So today's YouTube session is a very special one because it is our second Read for Pixels author panel session. So multi-author panel sessions are a recent addition to the Read for Pixels program. And the Pixel Project created these sessions to be an accessible resource for writers interested in writing about female characters and approaching themes such as misogyny, sexism, gender, and violence against women with depth, empathy, and accuracy. And so what better topic for our second panel session than We Are the Witches You Couldn't Burn, writing violence against women in horror in the age of Me Too. So here to take part in the discussion are three award-winning best-selling horror authors. Hilary Monahan is the New York Times best-selling author of Mary the Summoning and, under the Eva Darrow's name, the critically acclaimed The Awesome and Belly Up. Hilary writes everything from horror and comedy to science fiction, fantasy, and romance for young adult and adult audiences alike. 2020 sees her 12th novel in print. Sarah Langan is the author of 3 novels and dozens of short stories. Her novel, Audrey's Door, is under option with Octavia Spencer for adaptation, and her most recent story, Night Nurse, is under option with Paramount. Her next novel, Good Neighbors, is forthcoming from Simon & Schuster in fall 2020. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband, the filmmaker J.T. Petty, and 2 daughters. Christopher Golden is the award-winning best-selling author of such novels as The Myth Hunters, Wildwood Road, The Boys Are Back in Town, The Ferryman, Strangewood, and Of Saints and Shadows. He has also written books for teens and young adults, including Poison Ink, Soulless, and the thriller series Body of Evidence. He was honored by the New York Public Library and chosen as one of YALSA's best books for young readers. So upcoming teen novels include a new series of hardcover YA fantasy novels co-authored with Tim Levin and entitled The Secret Journeys of Jack London. So you, the audience, will be able to ask them questions live. Now, just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of your YouTube screen. And Anusha Kandasivam, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to Hilary, Sarah, and Christopher to answer. Now, before we begin, we thought you'd like to know that Hilary, Sarah, and Christopher have also donated some awesome treats to the stash of author goodies over at the Read for Pixels fundraising page to help keep the Pixel Project's programs and initiatives such as this one alive and kicking. So Christopher's Ben Walker book bundle and Sarah's Hex Life anthology have been snapped up by donors. Thank you to Yankton Robbins for donating to get the Ben Walker bundle, and to Habiba Aviram for donating to get the Hex Life anthology. However, if you are in the US, you can still get the following goodies from Hilary and Sarah if you donate to us. Now, Hilary has reserved 2 signed and personalized first edition hardcover copies of her latest book, The Hollow Girl, for Read for Pixels donors. And this is perfect for Halloween. You guys got to read this for Halloween. Guaranteed to make you think, guaranteed to make you hide under the covers. And Sarah has one more goodie available. She will tuckerize one super generous donor in her upcoming book, Good Neighbors, which is out in fall 2020.
That's cool.
Yeah. So please give generously. All funds go towards our work to help end violence against women, including the Read for Pixels campaign. We have raised $565 so far towards a $5,000 goal, so every dollar donated helps. And we'll be telling you where to go get these goodies a little later in the session. But now, onwards to the panel session. So, horror has been long lauded as a genre that addresses the deepest fears of culture and society. For example, much has been made of how zombie movies are social commentary on everything from consumerism and politics. However, as we all know, horror as a genre in both modern and folk storytelling has also traditionally not been kind to women. Writers or character, either the writers or the characters in the stories. So while other genres like science fiction, fantasy, and mystery or crime grapple with tropes like fridging, in horror, especially certain subgenres of horror, toxic masculinity and misogyny seem to be built in. And violence against women is far more visceral and extreme. And female characters are portrayed as everything from murderers, for example, Lizzie Borden in Dracula's Handmaidens, to victims. So countless horror movies can attest to that. And so let's go to the first question, which was, in your opinion, why does the horror genre turn to violence against women as plot devices and or catalysts for character development so often? Hillary?
Well, it's kind of funny. I think back to the fairy tale model, where fairy tales were originally in their inception morality tales. Little Red Riding Hood is literally do exactly what you're told, go straight home, don't talk to strangers, or you're going to get eaten and murdered. And I feel like horror in particular kind of toes that line, or more, not as recent. Things have gotten better, not great, but better. But it towed a line, and that was the line that it towed, was that women have always, their bodies have been policed, their chastity has been policed in particular, because it's viewed not really as they're not viewed as having agency, they're viewed as property of men usually. So these tales that are often crafted by men are almost in a way a way of controlling chattel. So for me, the reason why I think you see it in horror in particular is I think it's towing, because I mean, fairy tales, it depends on how you want to look at them, but some of them are very horrific, very, very horrific, particularly if you look at the original folklore of things versus, the sanitized Disney version that came along later. So I kind of feel like for me, we grew up with these horrific, the Grimm's version of the fairy tales versus the Disney version. And I think it was a natural segue to continue that way of controlling, because I mean, look at the slut's always the first one to die in the horror movie. If you look at any slasher film from the 70s and 80s, again, it's a morality tale. Don't, there's a reason why the survivor girl is always a virgin and, and good. So that's my first thought anyway.
Sarah?
I think, I agree with most of everything Hillary said. I also think there's just a general thinking about our society right now and why women are more often punished in film and underrepresented, and specifically in horror. There's less of them. And even if they're not murdered, if they're the final girl, they go through more psychological damage. Yep. And we're asked to identify with them. And I wonder if it's safer for a man to identify with a woman undergoing all this psychological damage. Not to get too gendered about it, because there's, all kinds of different identifications, than it is for the woman to watch this horror movie of the final girl. And I think we have a lot of internalized misogyny, and I have it just living in this world. We all have it. We've been raised on these cues. And I wonder if there's a feeling of safety, and like we've had life restored to the order it's supposed to be in the end of these movies, because the woman's been pushed down, and she deserved it, and our society feels good. So I think there's some of that too, that we're sort of pressing against in the last decade or so.
Chris?
I mean, the only thing I think I want to add to that is, I think that particularly as Hillary was referencing, fairy tales and we go through, we're talking about film, we're talking about television, particularly prior to this era, so often what's done to women in these stories is presented, whether directly or indirectly, as something that's really happening to the men around those women. So even if the woman is the heroine or the victim, if she's subject to the events of this story, so often in those stories, particularly in earlier eras, it's directly or indirectly the thing that's happening to the men in their lives. Dracula is a great example. You know, the story of Dracula is about Dracula sort of pursuing these women, but it's constructed as a story about how that affects the men around them. So obviously that's the thing we're trying to get away from.
It's kind of funny because, like, with Sarah, what she just said, just really kind of made something click in my head, that you effectively have built a parallel in my head, or a bridge in my head, between Survivor Girl and Manic Pixie Dream Girls. Like,
I don't know what that is.
So basically, Manic Pixie Dream Girl is a girl that is put solely in a book who has these fae-like qualities, where she's kind of boho and just a little bit odd, and just it's a very much a specific characterization, but fundamentally she kind of lacks any substance. She is literally there as an object to be wanted, pursued, desired, figured out by a male character. And the notion of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl is that she is a fabrication of male desire, not an actual person. For the first probably 10 years of her life, pretty much if Natalie Portman played it, that's a Manic Pixie Dream Girl. Sorry, but true. And now I'm realizing that it's that emptiness, that there's that similarity between the two tropes that I hadn't really put together before. So it's kind of horrible.
Yeah. So following on from what Sarah said about, you know, how we all seem to be marinating in patriarchy and misogyny, and we have to consciously look at it. When you guys have, I mean, when Sarah said we have to be aware of this. So so that's one pitfall when writing horror, I think, and also writing anything, science fiction, fantasy, and all, where authors have to be conscious of the culture that they're steeped in. So carrying on from that, so what are the other particular pitfalls that horror authors face when writing violence against women in their stories, and how can they avoid them? Yep, Sarah.
You know, I think there's the obvious. I have a rule. If someone asks me to blurb their work, I say, if it's a guy, is there a rape against a woman in this book? And if they say yes, I say no. But it could be great. You could have done a great job. I'm not going to blurb this book. I think you really need to think hard about sexual violence and how you portray it. That's rule number one. There's tons more rules. Someone else probably has something to say.
Yeah, Hillary?
Yeah, well, Sarah said pretty much mine. The Hollow Girl is quite literally about a sex assault, because I'm a survivor. And the Hollow Girl is a book about a survivor effectively punishing those who hurt her. And anytime that sexual assault is put in a book and it's there to make your villain twirl his mustache, you have reduced the victim as an orifice to advance somebody else's story. The victim is no longer the central figure in their own assault. And that's pretty messed up. You know, somebody's trauma is not supposed to be the focus of somebody else's story, as a motivator or whatever. So yeah, I'm gonna 45,000 times thumbs up what Sarah just said, because I wrote a book about it. So yeah, that.
Yeah. So Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I mean, look, as the sort of male voice here,
Token
And
guy.
more as the token dude, and more importantly, I think in this case, someone who's been doing this a really long time. I've been doing this long enough that when I started, there are definitely examples, particularly in my Peter Octavian books. There are a couple of examples of sexual assault, pretty explicit sexual assault in really horrifying ways in the first couple of books that I wrote. And there's a fridging in one of the books in that series. But I started writing that series in 1989, and my first novel was published or sold in 92. And I just feel like we need to listen. I mean, this is the thing about all of us, but men in particular, need to pay attention to the stories that we're telling and what needs to be in the story. If your story isn't about the trauma that goes along with sexual assault, you don't need a sexual assault in that story, period. And if it is about the trauma that goes along with sexual assault, you better damn well do your research and know what you're talking about if you have not been a survivor of sexual assault yourself. And so these are the things that you sort of learn over time. And one of the things I think that men in particular I think men are afraid to open their minds because then they have to focus on what they may or may not have done or said in the past. And so writers particularly older white male writers get locked into trying to defend certain elements of their work in order to not think they've done something wrong in the past. And so to me, it's all about that process. It's all about realizing that,
and that defense usually manifests in an argument about realism. It's very bizarre. Like when, Martin's work comes up, realism. Well, you know what? There's dragons in the book. If you can imagine a world without dragons, you can imagine a fantasy without rape in it. Sorry.
Right.
I mean, it's just paper thin at this point in time. So.
Right.
Yeah, and some historians also disagree with Martin and go, well, it depends on the region and stuff like that. So, but we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. That's grimdark. We're going to go down that rabbit hole later. On Sunday with Anna Smith Spark. But let's so building on that, what you guys just said, how can a horror writer figure out whether violence against women and any kind, rape, sexual assault, domestic violence, how can they figure out whether it belongs in their story or if their story can be told more effectively using other plot devices and catalysts? What's the one question they should ask themselves with?
I think with my most recent book, I had some things in it that were politically incorrect, right? But, I don't get out that much. I didn't know. So my agent looked at it and said, you have body horror happening to your villain who's a woman, and it's not right. It's ableist, but it's also, why do that? It's unrealistic. And I had to sit with it for like a week and be like, but I guess it's cool, and it upsets people when she looks gross, and think about it. And I realized that it's a better story without doing that. And I think that there's so many ways that all of us need to examine what we're doing. And if we do that, we just write much better stories. So I think the questions are get lots of readers, get lots of different kinds of readers who you have an honest relationship with, who will say like, yeah, this was like a little offensive to me. And sometimes it's like, well, you can't edit everything for offensiveness, but other times it's because your story is writing in archetypes, and that's fun and that progresses the plot, but it doesn't feel true or real. And the more true and real something is, it's always less offensive. So that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hillary?
Go ahead, Hillary.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, again, everything Sarah, I'm just going to let you go. You're doing all my work for me.
Because I'm like, let me talk.
No, but as far as I've seen this, and there is a Black non-binary creator on who works in the comics industry, who's at Wear Dogs. It's Danny on Twitter, and Danny tackled this beautifully about a month ago and said, you know, how do you not fall into that trope when it comes to people of color too, where you've got one person of color on an entire cast and they end up, you know, dying? And the answer was, have more people of color, but when it comes to your victim profile, have an even distribution was the recommendation. Meaning the violence that you see should be not catered to a person because of their gender or because of their labels. It should not be, you know, all the sexual violence is thrown at women for a point of reference. You know, again, first question of should it be there? But if you determine that it's something that's really important to your plot or whatever, and it is something that 20% of you know, cis women in the audience know about, and far higher numbers for your trans and non-binary audience. But if that's the case, then understand that, you know, if you're only doing that to your women, then that's not an egalitarian hand. If you are going to do violent acts in a work of fiction, there needs to be an egalitarian hand, and that means there needs to be more than one of anything that you victimize so that you can have a survivor. You know what I mean? So it's basically a thing of, you know, one way to do it is you can't avoid violence in horror. It's an imperative part of it. I mean, there are very few that are lacking horror altogether. I mean, even The Turn of the Screw, which is one of the ones that immediately came to mind that was not super violent, still had instances of it. You can't really escape it. But if you have an egalitarian hand with your victim profile and you don't fall into the tropes and the traps of, you know, what you expect of if your black guy is dying first every time. That's my immediate answer to that question, which is basically just be very careful with your cast, understand the labels of your cast, and understand what your choice is about who dies and who doesn't says. And that's my immediate thought.
You know, you said a lot of what I was going to say. The only thing I would add is it's about who dies and how they die. So be thinking about how you're. So Regina, I don't have any problem with, and let me be careful not to be misquoted. I don't have any problem with violence against women in horror if the violence is, as Hillary said, if you're equally sharing it, if you're not writing stories about violence against women specifically. I'm not interested in that, and that's so it isn't the violence, but it's also to me a question about, are you just being lazy? As Sarah said, like, is it just convenient? Is it easy to fall into the stereotypical way that you might execute this particular scene? And so all I would say is, you know, be a better writer. You know, write better books, read better books, and you'll learn better ways to go about how you handle these scenes, even if the scenes are very tropey and horrific.
Yeah, and you know, the next question actually follows on from what Hillary was talking about. You know, let's talk about techniques. So Hillary gave us one technique, which is, you know, equal distribution of violence again around your characters. So what are the other techniques that horror writers can use to diffuse and or turn toxic tropes of violence against women on its head if the story calls for the inclusion of, say, rape or domestic violence? Sarah? Or Hillary? Who wants to go first?
I think you can research domestic violence and you can research rape and find out, you know, read the newspaper articles, interview people, because it's never the story that you hear about. It's never the story that's on television. I think a lot of the problems with horror is a lot of the writers watch more TV than they read, and they're sort of writing what TV told them domestic violence looks like and what TV told them rape looks like. So that would be my first thing. Is it's like if you research that Kitty, what's her name, who was killed in the courtyard in Queens. It's not true. None of it's true. It's a much more interesting story than that. So, you know, there's always a more nuanced story than the one that's on TV.
I think when it comes to sexual violence, I use the term rape wallpaper. If rape wallpaper is there to set a scene, to set a mood, to show you how bad somebody else is, if rape wallpaper is just there to make your audience gasp, and then you never go back to it, don't do it. Don't do it. It's funny because I wrote a book that is quite literally a sexual assault survivor having to make some horrible decisions in order to right the wrongs done to her and to her boyfriend. But that said, you also need to be very careful with the whole, the protagonist is victimized and then is empowered by that victimization, like suggesting that the only way somebody can find their inner strength is by forcing sex on them. That's a really screwed up thing to communicate. And there's a lot of that where people are like, well, she goes all hard after this. No, she was hard beforehand. It was there beforehand. And I mean, that's a cautionary thing I would say is don't use somebody's victimization as a reason for why all of a sudden they were a badass. They were a badass before their victimization. Those parts were there. And the thing that happened to them does not necessarily define them. Those people change after assault. I certainly did. I still can't ride an elevator with mostly cis men, and it's been 20 years. But the fact is, that thing that happened to me 20 years ago, has it impacted me? Yes. Has it defined me? No. It can't be it can't be the thing that spurs your character onto greatness, because what that says is penetration makes women great. No. Thanks, but no. So that's one that I would lob out there.
Okay, Chris?
The only thing I would say is you also mentioned domestic violence. And in cases of both sexual assault and domestic violence, yeah, Sarah, I agree we can do research. But sadly, I doubt there are very many people who haven't either been victimized themselves or witnessed domestic violence or lived it in some other fashion, or have people who are very dear to you who have been in that situation. So I think that's part of it too. And domestic violence to me is sadly the fabric of reality in so many people's lives. And it shows up in crime stories and thrillers and in horror novels and in lots of other places in convenient ways that are often ugly and trite. But I think it also shows up in a lot of those same works in ways that are real and honest and painful and human. And I think that that's what we should be shooting for if we're including that.
Yeah. And Hillary, you and Sarah have been giving like perfect transitionals. All the points you make seem to perfectly transition into the next question on the list. This is awesome. So we're talking about not reducing victims to the sum of their trauma. So we don't want to reduce survivors of gender-based violence to some of their trauma in our stories. So do you guys have any one of you have any tips for writers to be mindful about when they want to include violence against women, but also they know that they have to be mindful about not reducing the characters to the sum of their trauma? What can they do? What are some of the things that they can do to avoid doing that?
Show hints of that stony character, that drive, that strength. Demonstrate it beforehand. Show it, show this character being that way before the terrible thing happens to them. Give us an idea that this person has, bones of steel, that they have a strong character and a strong drive and strength. And the other thing is that not all strength is physical. It really, really isn't. So, showing that as a creative will go very, very far, so that when the person has to overcome their obstacle, because we don't have a story if a protagonist doesn't overcome an obstacle, but when we know that the fiber of that person was established already, so that none of these things can be attributed to the person that victimized them. We don't want to give that person that credit.
Sarah?
So I love Megan Abbott. I think she's like a genius. I love her. But most of her books, the big reveal is one specific trauma. And I think none of us are made from one specific trauma. So I think it's just it's really easy and it's really poppy right now to write like that, to have these very realistic stories where you find out, you know, that one specific abuse happened. You know, the girl's foot got run over by a lawnmower, and now everything has changed, right? So I think it's important to inspect these things because it's a little too poppy. That's all I have to say. I mean, I think Hillary covered most of the other aspect of it, but it's sort of like the one with the the Kevin Spacey movie where he's shot in the beginning and he's retelling his story. You know that movie from years ago?
The Usual Suspect?
No. Where there's like a garbage bag that they keep talking about is how beautiful it is.
Oh,
Is it American Beauty? No.
Yeah, American
Beauty, yeah.
American Beauty. Yeah.
It's like 20 years
like
old.
that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Where it's like everybody, I feel like that's the poppy way to do it. Where it's like everyone had one specific thing. Like if you called a girl ordinary, she'd, you know, become the Wicked Witch and you'd poured water on her and you destroyed her. I think that's Hollywood loves that and book publishers love that.
And the thing that's really upsetting about it is that trauma is usually not a one-stop shop. Trauma is so many. Okay, so you've got the assault itself, and now you have all right, it happened at a party. How do you get home? Okay, your keys are inside with the person that just did this. Okay, so now how do you get home? And if you've been drinking, is it a safe drive home? And then do you tell people? And if you do tell people, do they believe you? And if they don't believe you, how do you deal with that? And if they do believe you and you go to the police, what happens then? Because if anybody's ever been through a rape exam, it is incredibly violating. Like it is horrific on every physical level after you've already been savagely attacked by somebody else. So like it's oversimplified idea of what trauma is. Like a single event is the thing. And the reality is it's almost never a single event. It is a culmination of a lot of really odious parts. And when you write that way, it almost, I'm not going to say that it diminishes actual victims, but it's suggesting such a cut and dry approach to trauma. And trauma it's this intricate multi-layered web, and it's just gross. So if that's the case, make sure you're looking at the multi factors that are contributing to that trauma, because you're absolutely right. It's, you know, having that be the linchpin for a narrative it's folly, and it's not close to the reality of the thing. So,
and Hillary, as you were talking about that, I was just thinking about the way that memories are actually stored in the human brain, you know, and that a writer ought to think about that, where it's not going to be just this one specific memory of being hit or being raped. It's going to be all different kinds of things.
Chris,
I'd be curious. Actually, I have not read the novel, but I have watched the series. I'd be curious to know if you have watched the series or read the novel Big Little Lies, because based on what you're talking about, I loved the way that for all of those characters, whatever, each have different traumatic histories and different kinds of trauma, but none of them experience one moment of trauma. They all have been through, in each instance, you sort of a spiraling sequence of events in their lives that have led them to this particular moment, sort of a flashpoint moment. But that's the fiction part. The flashpoint moment is the fiction part. It's the sort of large and small traumas that they've experienced that lead to that. So
I've heard, I haven't read it, but I've heard that people with PTSD have actually spoken about that in my feed. I can't remember who it was, but they said that it had almost a feeling that somebody who had written it had probably experienced PTSD because of the intersecting layers of it. So I wouldn't be surprised if you find out the creative might know a thing or two about it.
right.
Yeah, and domestic violence is literally a whole sequence of horrific treatment, experiencing horrific treatment sometimes over the course of decades.
Yep.
And like Hillary said, it just piles up. So when we read a book, and I mean personally, when I read a book and and it doesn't look at those layers, it doesn't take into account those layers, those years and years of, trauma piled one over the other, and fossilize, it doesn't ring true.
No, it doesn't, particularly if they don't do things like address the gaslighting that goes along with it and the emotional abuse that always accompanies the physical abuse. Because writing about slapping somebody across the face or beating somebody up is one thing. Yeah, that happens. But what happens much more often is emotional abuse. And, you have to keep a person living in that house with you, too afraid to leave. And that's not always going to be a physical trauma. That's going to be an emotional abuse trauma. So, oversimplifying it is doing no one any favors.
I can't think of a book that's done a good job of that.
No, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine, I'm not going to name any names, but in her particular instance, he used to hide the keys on her so she couldn't leave the house, which is not, that's not him.
It's not unusual. I've heard of that.
But that happens a lot. He would hide her keys, her cell phone, the modem in the house, and her laptop. So she had nowhere to go, no way to get out, and no way to talk to anybody or anything. And that kind of control, oh my gosh, like that is just, it's so horrifying on every possible level. And there are very few narratives that explore that angle of things effectively, or that, that the emotional abuse sustains the paradigm where the physical abuse can happen. So, if you're writing domestic abuse, there's a lot there to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Christopher's right. Like Big Little Lies is one of the very few that manage to do that, and they do that from the point of view of different characters. And Mary San Giovanni actually writes very well about domestic violence in her books as well.
Mary's
so
great.
It's all multi-layered, basically.
Yeah, Mary's a wonderful writer. So.
Yeah, and we have a question from the audience. So let's take a break from this and have a question from the audience. But Zigzag Claiborne, okay, guys, sorry about covering your faces at the bottom of the screen. We seems to have the question seems to have covered you guys and can't do anything about it. So Zigzag Claiborne asks, with the colonization of female agency by men needing to center themselves, so your pain is my pain. How hard do you see it for re-evaluating approaches to writing about and for women? Anyone?
Go ahead, Sarah. No. I started the last two. You go.
I'm not really sure what the question refers to. Is it because there's a couple of things. I think that as writers, we all have, it's the job, and it's the excellent part of the job is to imagine other people's lives. And there's this really gray area in saying that men can't do this. And so, this is all coming out, and a lot of men are saying like, oh my God, I'm really interested in this, and this is really important to me, and I will write about it. And we're all like, shut up, you don't get to talk about this. So I think there's a couple of things going on. And that men needing to be the center of it. Well, we're all trying to be the center of the zeitgeist. So it's not just them. And it's just that more men are in charge and more men get the deals and more men they just get more stuff. So, I'm all for men colonizing the Me Too movement. Good. It's just our movement too. Obviously, we're the genesis of the movement. So
Yeah.
I think if you're creative, and you are going to co-opt, I guess, and I only use co-opt for lack of a better verb, but if you are going to write a story that does focus women's trauma, I think one thing, I don't think it's impossible to push back against that. I think it's very easy, and that's to ask the creative, who did you read? What books did you read or would you recommend by a woman who experienced this trauma or who knows this trauma? So create what you want, but make sure that you have read, can recommend and interact with that source material from every other gender that's not a cis guy. You know what I mean? Like, so basically, I don't think it's impossible to push back against that. I think what it is make sure that if you're somebody that's writing that trauma, you can turn around and recommend books by other genders that speak to the same thing. Show that you cared enough to read it, to engage with it, to perhaps see it from first person point of view. I'm definitely not the first author that wrote a book about a victim having to do bad things after their victimization. But I am a woman who was assaulted. So if you're writing a book about a rape revenge story, make sure that you know, if not my name, then the name of another woman who did that. And make sure that when you're sitting there going, look at my work, look at how great it is, you can recommend somebody who did it from perhaps a more organic standpoint. And, be sure that when you do that, you're looking at things like, cis privilege and racial privilege and ableist and ableism and stuff like that. Make sure that you can look at it from different axes of identity who interact with the exact same topic that you're going to go at. So that's if we're looking at ways to overcome the colonization aspect of violence against women, be able to recommend people who aren't other cis men and their art as a way to fight back.
So I would add a couple of things. I actually think that it's in, I guess this is not what Zigzag is saying, but if men are writing books about this subject, or if you've decided to write a thriller and the focus is this because the Me Too movement is important in our pop culture and in our culture right now, and should be forever, that's disgusting. Like, to me, it's just like, that's not the reason to write a book. If you are a male who's writing about this, obviously, Hillary, I agree with everything you just said, but I would also say that presumably in your life, there are people who've experienced these things. And maybe if you're tell me if I'm wrong, because I'm just taking the temperature here, but I feel like if you are a man who lives in this world, you have women in your life who have experienced these things. And if you are not the kind of man with whom those women will have shared their experiences, you're not the kind of man who should be writing that book. That's my first thing. And then my second thing is that you shouldn't be, which I'm talking about in general now, it isn't just I think that it's vital and valid and necessary for men to speak up about Me Too, not just in the things that we see, but also in the things that we've done, regardless of what our age was at the time. Because if we all pretend that we've never done anything, then when women say Me Too, and every man says, well, but not me, I've never done anything wrong, then it's basically negating the experience of those women. So men should be talking about it and championing the women who are speaking. However, amplifying the women's voices is more important than using your own as a man. yeah. So go ahead.
No, I'm also gonna say this. I need it. That point is absolutely, to me, 100% resonating is true. But if you don't know who Tarana Burke is and you're talking about Me Too, there's an issue there, because this was an initiative that started with a Black woman for Black communities.
Yeah.
And if you are going to put a voice first, if you're putting Alyssa Milano first over Tarana Burke, I have questions. You have a responsibility to know where these things came from, who got these things off the ground, and basically who got ignored,
Right.
and for reasons why. So I absolutely agree with everything you're saying, and I'm kind of doing the conjunction with what I was saying before.
Right.
Is if you're going to even go there and you don't know who Tarana Burke is, don't go there. You don't deserve.
Well, let me just add this, though, to be clear, though, Hillary. I think that if something I said brings you to Alyssa Milano, and something Alyssa Milano says brings you to Tarana Burke, that's totally fine and legitimate way for you to get to that. So I want to make sure that men who are hearing this are understanding that, and women who are hearing this are understanding that we're not saying that if you don't currently know who Tarana Burke is, that you shouldn't be talking about Me Too. We're saying that you should be writing about it until you followed the trail back to its origins.
Yeah, and that was my comment, was almost more of a segue on where you start is with you getting that message of Me Too out.
Right.
But white cis women need to also do their diligence to make sure that we are looking at who we're talking over. So you're worried about talking over all women, and white women need to be worried about who they're speaking over too. It's not like it ends just with men. And that's, that's the intersection of IDs again. So
yeah. So let's get back to writing. So in Canada, recently, at the Toronto International Film Festival, Indigenous filmmakers are using horror to unpack the trauma of colonization. Do you think horror can be used to unpack the trauma of violence against women? And if so, how can horror authors do this?
I think women writing horror tend to do this already. So I'm not totally surprised to hear it as, I wrote that book not because it made me happy. I wrote that book to deal with my own trauma, to empower myself and to explore the emptiness that went along with my own assault. So I absolutely believe that horror is a great vehicle to force empathy and can educate just like any other medium. It's just more in your face. Let's be realistic. The consequences are much more, in fact, and in a way, horror is wonderful for it because the consequences in horror are so much bigger than, your slow moving drama. Like if in a horror movie, if it goes poorly, you might end up in a wood chipper, it's a effective way of communicating it graphically. So almost it's going to leave an imprint, a longer, more lasting thing because it's horrific and terrible and so yeah, I think horror can do that. I think all of the things that we actually previously talked about, which is being careful with your victim profiles and looking at how trauma intersects and whose stories are being told and by whom and in which way, and is it upholding the colonizer or the colonized, that kind of a thing. So yeah, I think it's really, actually, I didn't know that, and I'm gonna have to check out some films now because that's really cool.
I'll forward you the article, Hillary.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. Chris was going to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that many years ago, and this is pertinent to this, Robert R. McCammon, legendary horror author Robert R. McCammon, did an interview in Fangoria magazine that has stuck with me ever since. And he talks about horror in general and why write horror. And what he talks about is that horror as a genre is the vehicle for you to address anything. You can write about love and hate and sex and violence. You can write about loss. You can write about trauma. You can write about nostalgia. You can write, you can write about anything. You can write, so you can have science fiction. You can have fantasy. You can have Western. You can do whatever you want. You can, and anything can fall under that umbrella. So, horror is the perfect vehicle from my perspective to address anything, particularly something that haunts us and hurts us. And so talking about the the experiences of indigenous peoples, talking about violence against women, talking about trauma. I think if it's done right, horror can be the vehicle to address all kinds of things. I think about things like the Babadook, and it just. Anyway, I'll shut up. But yes,
Babadook's awesome though, because it's a story about anxiety.
right.
I mean, it was a fantastic way to talk about what anxiety does to you. So it's a great example.
I've been thinking a lot about Rosemary's Baby and the Stepford Wives, and I love them. And I think they so much reflect the culture. And it goads me that a man wrote them, and he wrote them so well.
Yeah.
And I would love to be the woman who writes the next thing that's emblematic of our current culture. And I think it's coming. I think someone's going to do it. And I think it'll be enlightening. I mean, Rosemary's Baby was shocking for moments like, it's not fair to Dr. Saperstein that you're going to get a second opinion, where it's like, oh yes, of course a husband would say that to his wife. And you see it or you read it and it's horrifying.
I mean, what's more horrifying right now than watching The Handmaid's Tale?
Yeah.
I'm serious. It's one thing to read the book, but to watch the TV series The Handmaid's Tale, it is more of a horror show than anything else. It's so horrifying to watch.
Mm-hmm. And you put me in mind. There's a Sarah.
You don't feel that way. Sarah disagrees, but the Dr. Saperstein moment is horrifying. I think that a show that's Mike Pence's wet dream is even more terrifying. But anyway,
it is terrifying. But for a lot of women, it is. Sadly, it is what they call or we call reality in many parts of the world. So it's horrifying to people who haven't experienced it. But when some of us watch it on screen, we go like, "Oh, look, that's my life."
Yeah.
Don't know which is more horrifying. Being able to being so used to it that you go, "Oh, that's my life."
You're desensitized to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So before we go to the next viewer question, let's talk about consent in horror. So a lot of horror story stems from the lack of consent. Something is being done to you and it's horrible and it's horrifying. You can't, at least for part of the book or part of the story or part of the film, you can't do anything about it. You just keep getting attacked. And do you think that consent is an issue that horror writers has started addressing successfully in recent years? And what can horror writers do to tackle the issue of consent in their stories?
I'm immediately thinking of Shannon Maguire here, aka Mira Grant, because I think she writes most of her horror under Mira Grant. Shannon, years ago, committed to zero sexual assault and discourse about consent in her fiction. So I think it's a thing we're starting to see. I think it's a thing that we should work on more. But at the same time, I do think there's whispers of it. I think it's very much a germ at this point in time. But she was immediately who my brain went to, was because Shannon has been very vocal about this subject. And as such, I have been able to freely recommend her books, fantasies and horrors, to victims who want to engage with the material but are so afraid of being triggered by that kind of stuff that she's a safe place to land. So.
She definitely is. She talked about this rule of hers when she did Read for Pixels with us. She said we really don't need to re-traumatize readers who already experienced this trauma. So Sarah, any thoughts?
I'm blanking on instances where I've seen consent arise in anything I've read, at least lately. Skip me. I'll come back to me.
The only thing I was going to say is you just made me think about this, Regina, in the sense that one of the reasons I think that horror is horrific to male readers or viewers is that while men, and we haven't really talked about men who've suffered assault because this is a conversation about violence against women, but there are lots of men, including people I know, who've suffered sexual assault and physical assault and other forms of abuse. But by and large, one of the reasons horror is so horrific when male readers are reading it is because it's the one time where most men don't get consent, right? So this thing that women are used to in fiction, especially, and a lot of times in life, only arises for men in cases of violence and horror and when they're reading fiction. So if they're identifying with a male character, that male character no longer has control of the situation. That's unusual for men. And so I think it's an interesting subject to be. It's an onion that needs to be peeled that I haven't really spent any time thinking about before. So
yeah. So let's go to a question from the audience. I apologize ahead of time again. This is a longish question, so Hillary and Sarah will sadly be temporarily covered up by the question when it comes.
I'll just do this to make it.
So Alex Norcross asks, are there any particular works, fiction or nonfiction, that you would recommend as touch points for better understanding domestic violence and sexual assault?
Mary was a great example, Regina. When you said her earlier, she does write domestic abuse and psychological horror very, very well. So I would definitely put her out there immediately. I would put Shannon out there immediately for similar reasons. I'm trying to think of what else. Honestly, I'm going to be very, very frank. A lot of the sex assault books that I've read personally are issue books, not horror books, because, I have a hard time with it. Personally. So I tend to read things that are specifically going to center victims, and often narratives. Courtney Summers books that talk about assault are YA, but they are heartrending. And they're horror to me, but they're probably not going to be for, anybody else who reads them. But I tend not to engage with that personally, so I don't have a whole lot to offer there.
Sarah, any recommendations?
I'm actually thinking of Peyton Place, which I read driving across the country, and I was stunned, and I think it's considered a crappy soap opera, and yet I read it. It's an excellent book about domestic abuse. It's one of those things where if a woman's subject must be stupid, but it's actually great, and it's absolutely worth reading.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I come to is, and it's not horror, obviously, is going back to Big Little Lies. I need to read the novel, but my understanding is that the first season of the series is a very faithful adaptation, and there are a lot of nuances in there, and I'm sure that there's way more in the book. So I want to do that myself.
Elena Ferrante. I'll just keep saying her name because I love her so much, but absolutely, she's great at it. And I think she showed there was a real thirst for people for that kind of book.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say, Alex, Alex is one of our supporters. And Alex, we can email you the list of, for the last 3 years, every November, we published a list of 16 books every November for the 16 days of activism that we recommend for folks to try to read about domestic violence, about sexual assault, a story, not just fiction, but nonfiction as well. So to expand from Alex's question, what would you recommend people watch? Because horror is also in movies, but I mean, I was gonna put in there that, Alex, if you want to see how a TV series can handle issues like sex, sexual assault, rape, domestic violence, try Quantum Leap. I know it's old, but I've just been rewatching it, and there are episodes that really, really deal extremely well with these topics. Hillary, Sarah, Christopher, any recommendations for what they can watch as well?
But yeah, we're all sighing. This is a question I would have prepped for. I would have come up with.
Yeah,
movies.
I know, because they're well. I mean, they're. Gosh, whenever I think of things like sexual assault, I go back to that Jodie Foster movie, which was one of the worst.
The Accused?
Yeah, The Accused. As far as movies that showed, I mean, again, it comes down to what's horror for you, because The Accused to me was a friggin' horror movie. It was awful, and it was, basically they managed to convict her rapist, and then they were going to go back and convict or go after the other people that witnessed the crime and did nothing about it. That to me, though, the one thing about that stuck with me, even though it's an older film, again, was how hard it was, because she had worn a short skirt and had a drink to prove that what had happened to her was not an invited thing. It was basically the thing about The Accused that did resonate as true was the character assassination of the victim. Systematically character assassination. When it's that thing of when I was roofied, the question was, well, why were you in that bar? It's a rough bar. Because I wanted a beer. And I was there with a friend. And that's why I was in that bar. But the onus then becomes, why did I put myself in the scenario where I'd be roofied instead of why was some guy there roofing people? So The Accused is one of those movies that made me incredibly uncomfortable when I saw it, because I saw it later. I didn't see it. I was little when it came out. And then I saw it years later. And that did do the character assassination aspect of sex assault victims very, very well in a gross way.
Unfortunately, I can only think of bad examples. I mean, off the top of my head, the first thing that comes to mind is a scene, and again, it's triggering, I'm sure, but the scene where in The Sopranos, where Dr. Melfi, the Lorraine Bracco character, is assaulted on the stairs. And I still remember how it was done in a way that was incredibly brutal. So it's not, it doesn't make it sexy in any way. And yet there's still something about the way it was shot that I don't know. It seemed totally unnecessary and extraneous to me. So I'm trying to come up with an example of something that seemed necessary and a good part of the story. Sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
I can't think of one. All I can think of, I was
going to say that there was that Monica Bellucci and Vincent Castle movie that was told in reverse, where Monica Bellucci is brutally raped on screen for, I think it's something like 7 or 8 minutes. And I shut it off. And it was because it served no purpose other than to do this is how bad and depraved this person was. So it's so much easier to name poor examples, like Christopher said, than it is to name good examples that did it properly. I'm sitting here going back to Rob Roy, which was a Liam Neeson movie where I think it was Jessica Lange, and that was also very it was definitely not for the women in the audience. It was more mustache twirling. That's the thing, is once it gets to a certain point, in most cases where sexual assault is the thing, it's mustache twirling to show you how bad a guy is, to not speak to the trauma of the victim. It is almost always this is how bad he is, and let's show you in a way that isn't, and that's the problem. So I can't really give you any, Regina. I'd love to, but I can't think of any.
I just want to add one thing that, and this may be unpopular. If my wife and daughter were in the room, it would be a very unpopular thing for me to say, because we all watch Outlander and we love it. But if you've seen the TV series Outlander, and any of you watched Outlander?
I watched
a million years ago. Yeah.
Outlander is a very rapey show.
It's bad.
It's not rapey in the Game of Thrones level. Hi, how are you? I'll be careful.
I'm gonna go into a different room.
Yes, please do.
I just like the side view, the side invasion of.
So Outlander, and yet
Okay, you have to go get Daddy. Okay.
Should I switch topics? Okay. So the thing is, and now I'm laughing talking about this subject. Okay. So there are multiple instances over the course of the series thus far in which female characters are raped. And although there are there is PTSD involved, some of it is handled seemingly well and better. But when the main male character is raped, that is handled in a much more sensitive way, and the aftermath and the PTSD involved in that is handled with at greater length.
I could do a whole panel on this, by the way.
Yeah, and with more focus. Yeah.
I just have one to name, and it's Happiness, that Todd Solondz movie, where the child molester jerks off in front of the main character, Joy. I don't have an office. And
I'm sorry, I'm a bad person.
Yes, it's fine. So she's hurt. She's injured by it in the moment, and then she's able to. Her sister wants to set her up on another date with another creep, and she's like, "I'll get his number this time," and she's fine. And that seemed like a realistic. She wasn't ruined, even though she's a really sensitive person. She's like had strength. I think that was well done. And then Chris, what you were talking about, it reminded me of the Tarantino movie, which was the one with the rape, the guy rape in it, where it's like they do cut to.
Pulp Fiction.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
It's kind of sad that we all struggle. It's a sad statement on the
Yeah,
state
it really is. It's terrible.
TV and movies that, I mean, we try to come up with a good example of horror that tackles the issue properly. It did.
We're not even talking about horror, though.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the thing about Outlander, and I'll just toss this out there real quick, because like I said, I could go on this tangent for a while. But the thing about Outland is that it you know that thing I said earlier about realism. So because it was realistic that women were raped so much back then, it's less of a noteworthy thing worth exploring in the narrative than the idea that the cis man and the hero was raped. And here's the thing that's really screwed up about that. By Rain's last numbers, cis men experience rape at I think at about 12%. I could be wrong on that. So give or take like 2% on it. And it's like half of cis women, but it's because there's so much non-reporting because of toxic masculinity, about victimhood and things like that. But the thing that bothered me about Outlander as a book and as a show is that it's kind of upholding that like female victims are expected to be assaulted, so it's not worth investing in that time, but because he's considered aberrant, but that's not true. Everybody's a victim of sexual assault. There is no identity that gets a free pass and doesn't get victimized in sexual assault. So there's a lot there to unpack. Makes me very angry.
Yeah, so speaking of toxic masculinity, do you guys think, well, not you guys, sorry, do y'all think that there is room in horror for reframing how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability? Can that be one of the ways that horror authors can break away from toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women? Sarah?
Yeah, I think so. The biggest thing for me that drives me crazy is the trope of the woman getting attacked or raped and the man in her life needing to defend her, or the daughter stolen. It's like every Hollywood movie is like, his daughter was stolen and he had to get her. And it's that dynamic that she's harmless and she's not she's a possession. And this man isn't a person either. He's just a bunch of weird hormones. And I think once you break that apart, you get to see more interesting things.
It's funny. My immediate answer for this was Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Weirdly, no.
I love
Dale
that.
is a marshmallow. He is the sweetest person. He's nice, but he's not a pushover, you know. And I love that movie anyway because of a lot of trope subversions, including the fact that we have a fat protagonist who's, you know, as a fat person, this is a big deal. But like, I think that movie actually does a really good job of going against toxic masculinity, and I think it's trying to on purpose, because you have Tucker and Dale, two, you know, country gents, versus the douche bros in the woods, you know, the douche bro college kids, and it's basically pitting the toxic masculinity versus, you know, these two guys who just want to go to their cabin in the woods, and then everything goes wrong. So do I think that the genre can do it? Yeah. And I think in the best examples of it, it already is doing it. So yeah, that was one of the, I think it's feasible. I think it's already being done in small doses. I just think you have to be smart about it when you think about it. But Tucker and Dale is a lot of more, it's a funny movie, but it's actually a very clever movie in a lot of ways.
Yeah. You know, it's, and also the relationship between the two guys is incredibly sweet.
Yeah.
It's
a wonderful, loving friendship between two guys.
And it reminds me a lot of, they're not horror, except maybe the first one, but Joe Lansdale's Hap and Leonard novel.
Hap and Leonard, yep.
You know, Hap and Leonard are these two guys. One guy is gay, one guy is straight. They're polar opposites in other ways as well, you know, and they just are best friends and they love each other, and that's fine. But they're also like, you know, they prove that macho doesn't have to mean asshole. You know what I mean? They're not going to take any shit from anybody. And I think that's an important message, right? You know, like, you can be sweet, but also stand up for yourself. And yeah, the level of I think, to what Sarah was saying, I think we have to be proactive in how we present characters in our fiction and turn those stereotypes on their heads. I did these pseudonymous shark novels, and the first one is an ensemble. But by the time you get to the end of the story, what you find is that the heroes of the story are a 22-year-old lesbian and a middle-aged black gay guy. And they're the two people who really saved the day in this book. And there was at least one review that was very upset that they went in for this shark novel and they got that nonsense, you know. But I think it's incumbent upon us, if you have a platform to, and everybody has a voice, you know, like, to turn those expectations on their heads. Toxic masculinity, like, everybody complained about Gillette's toxic masculinity ad. If you haven't,
they were wonderful.
It's fantastic. And honestly, I don't care if Gillette did it for purely commercial purposes. The fact is, they did it. So even if they did it because they thought they'd make more money by doing it than not doing it, it still puts it out there in people's faces, and people still see and experience that ad. That's vital to what we have to do.
It's also probably worth mentioning that I think Us and Get Out are two horror films that also I don't think he interacts with it directly as a subplot, but it's definitely there. And what's also interesting in particular with Get Out is that it's there as the difference in a racial dynamic too, of what toxic masculinity looks like, you know, from white guys versus, you know, people of color. So I think he is another one that intersects with this particular conversation well as a creative who can be trusted. You know, I feel it's awful, but I feel like you gotta kind of like green light, red light a lot of people, but he does well. So
yeah, and just want to slip in an interesting point. So just before this session, yesterday I posted up in a very active urban fantasy Facebook group, that because urban fantasy is kissing cousins with horror, because they also have werewolves and all. And I said, and I basically said, urban fantasy fans, give me a list of books that you can recommend where the male protagonist or the male supporting character is a cinnamon roll. I gave them a few examples, like Kai in Rebecca Roanhorse's Six Worlds
Yep.
series.
Yep.
Like who else? Like Jem Carstairs in Cassandra Clare's series. And the funny thing is, nobody could really. There weren't that many. Like
No.
people were actually sitting there thinking really, really hard, and there was a discussion about this going. Well, this character gets really good later on in the series, becomes a cinnamon roll, but at the beginning, it's still really dominating, trying to, So,
There's
yeah.
the other trope of the sassy gay friend who's usually the cinnamon roll aspect in some way, or can play that in, the soft boy kind of character. But then that usually butts right up against problematic portrayals of queer men.
Can I just interrupt to ask, what is a cinnamon roll?
Someone who's really, really good, almost, really,
Sweet.
really good and kind and sweet, and faces a lot of adversity, but in themselves, they're not violent unless they have to in situations.
Yeah.
They can be badass. They can be really badass fighters, but they're sweet and kind, and they treat women in their. If it's a male cinnamon roll, they treat women in their lives with respect.
Tucker and Dale is a good example of a cinnamon roll. He is the total cinnamon roll. So, but yeah, the thing about it is that everything I'm coming up with is basically sitcom sidekick gay men, which, again, another issue, and not horror. I mean, I've said before, and I'll say it again here. I love horror. I want to write horror stories that look like me and my friends, which that means they're queer and they're disabled, and I have friends of color. I'm biracial, but I look like skim milk. So, but it's one of those things that I want to see more of it. But I feel that right now, horror is behind the curve. Fantasy, I can name you 6 authors with various marginalizations off the top of my head who are changing the world, who are doing it. And with horror, I can think of Stephen Graham Jones, because Mongrels is one of my favorite books, who's doing, amazing things. And, there was this collection of short stories featuring all Black creatives and all non-cis male. I don't know if it was all women. There might have been non-binary and trans folks in there. I'm not sure. But it was Psycho X's Daughters, which Linda Addison edited last year, and it was up for a Stoker, and that was freaking amazing. But these are Sylvia Marino Garcia, and her vampire book was just amazing. But it's such a small pool. In YA, you're starting to see Dread Nation by Justina Ireland came out, and that was well received, and you're starting to see it over there. But I feel like where fantasy really started to push this a couple years ago, and they're definitely not there yet, but at least the initiative was there. Horror is just starting to have these conversations now. They're a good couple of years behind everybody else. And even now, there was a creative list on an anthology that came out, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, with guys who should have known better, that had, I think, 1 woman on the list total. And I don't know if there were any people of color. I think there was one guy of color, but
that's the other conversation.
Yeah. But I mean, that's the thing, is horror is still very much behind the curve, where we're celebrating Rebecca Roanhorse and Fonda doing her Jade series and stuff like that. Horror is just not there yet, but I think it will be, because I think it's starting to go that way. Linda Addison is freaking amazing. Yeah, I just saw a comment and I'm like, yes.
Yeah. I will just say, in horror's defense, that I think one of the big reasons I agree with you 1,000%, but I think one of the big reasons for that is because the volume of horror that is published professionally is so much smaller than the volume of fantasy that is being published professionally, and the attention is so much smaller. Horror has just in the last 18 months to 2 years started to climb up again and have a little bit more awareness and have a little bit more attention. And I think the more we see of that, the more we're going to see Victor LaValle break through, the more we're going to see
was so good.
So that it's there. But I agree with you, and I think part of that is because a massive percentage of the horror that's published is not published professionally, and many of the writers are not have not paid attention. They're not necessarily up to par. One of the things that happened when horror crashed, Sarah, like Once Upon a Time, is that so many writers went to other genres.
Yeah.
Right? They went and they wrote fantasy, or they wrote supernatural thrillers or whatever it might be. And so I think that as we see horror coalesce, we hope it continues to rise. We will see more Stephen Graham Jones, Victor LaValle, Silvia Moreno Garcia begin to gather steam. And also we have writers like Carmen Maria Machado.
Oh God, Carmen is wonderful. Yeah.
She's amazing.
That's her that Joe recommended. Joe Hill recommended.
Yeah.
Carmen's
Maria
writing is
Devana Headley. Maria Devana Headley, who are terrific writers. Molly Tanzer, they're writing, particularly Carmen and Maria Devana Headley are writing, they're writing horror, but it's sort of horror adjacent. And I think that part of that is, again, that sort of ghettoization of horror as a label. So I think if we take the pool of people who are really doing horror right now and are rising, it's better than we think it is, but we need to be in that stage where we're saying, yes, that's horror. So
you just reminded me that I should have mentioned Alyssa Wong by now and Cassandra Khaw, both of which write horror. They're amazing creatives who write horror that's very socially conscious and terrifying, mostly psychological slant, but definitely creatives who should have been mentioned before now. I'm space cadetting on you. Sorry.
Right. Oh, and also back to the other question about the representation of sexual assault and domestic violence. Again, read Carmen Maria Machado. Her short story "Difficult at Parties" is like,
yeah,
it's tough, but it's exactly what we're looking for.
Yeah. Before we go, that's probably where we should wrap up. But before we go, here are a few, some of the feedback from the audience. So for Hillary, Nusha says, I love Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Alex says, yes, Sarah, yes, the knight in shining armor trope is way overused. And Zigzag Claiborne, he's really happy when you say everybody has a voice.
Yep. And
Christopher, if it's any consolation, I was not familiar with the cinnamon roll outside of
With Alex is like me, though, right now he's wanting something really sweet and tasty.
Yeah. So I'm just going to say that some of the writers that tackle violence against women best in their books actually are in urban fantasy. Next door, adjacent to horror. Faith Hunter does it extremely well in her Soulwood series. Alex, if you want to go check that out. Patty Briggs, Patricia Briggs handles rape in the Mercy, in both her Alpha and Omega series and the Mercy Thompson series very well. And you know what is kind of weird about horror is the same thing that has happened in crime and mystery, which is horror has, correct me if I'm wrong, and this is to wrap up before we go, horror has technically, I would say, been started by women. Mary Shelley is one of the foremothers of horror with Frankenstein, and then we have Shirley Jackson, who is such a huge figure in horror that there's an award named after her. But why do you think that it's still so male-dominated? We know that things are changing, especially in the last couple of years, but why do you guys think that horror is still so male-dominated?
If you ever have the opportunity to see Grady Hendrix speak, I would highly recommend it because the guy's got an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure paperbacks in horror in particular. And one of the things that he spoke about the last time that I was there was that basically all of the stuff, like when you think of your paperback 80s novels, like, the ones that got me into horror as a kid, certainly, and King fits into that, and, Straub and the usual suspects, Clive Barker and stuff like that, they all kind of rose at the same time. But one of the things he talks about is there were tons of female authors in that horror craze in the 80s. tons. And the problem is the publishers don't reprint them. They don't republish them. They're nowhere to be found. So you're going to be able to go in anywhere and pick up any of the classics. You're going to be able to get, Lightning or Watchers from Kuntz or, any of that stuff. But any of the female contemporaries for the backlist are completely gone. They're not there. And that's true of mid-list authors in general, but there's almost an erasure aspect to the female creatives that really were popular at the time that horror had its heyday. And hello, child. Bye, child. But yeah, and one thing, why do I think it's that way? I think it's because when they had to prioritize whose books got to stick around, they prioritized based on who they thought the readers were, which was cis white guys. Straight cis white guy, that's what they thought was reading it. So those were the people that got the longevity, and the numbers backed it up at the time, but they never looked back at that backlog and the tons and tons of women creatives who were around in the 80s. And look at urban fantasy in the 90s and how it pioneered the whole thing. As far as we're looking at, there's just this erasure aspect of, we have a very short memory with female creatives in general, and the publishing model is not helping that at all.
Sarah?
I was going to say it's the Peyton Place issue where women's stories tend to be considered less important. And, even looking now at what's popular in horror and breaking out, it's the male domestic story. And then the female domestic story is pushed into thriller. Yep. And so it's just, we still have internalized this idea that women aren't able to tell cogent, important stories, that male voice is more authoritative, is more definitive. And I think I think it's an internal issue. I think because more women buy books, more women read,
more women.
There's not an explanation for it. Well, these editors and these publishers and what's getting put out and what's getting valued is the dick in the room. Pardon me.
The thing I said on Twitter a couple weeks ago that seemed to resonate with people is true crime is a facet of horror, and the fans are predominantly females. All the people that are eating up these true crime documentaries and these books that are releasing and the thrillers are the women audience, but it all comes down to how you define horror. And that is very, very personal. And, at this case, in this atmosphere, women are still struggling for, it's not just women. It's women, and basically any marginalized identity is still struggling for a place at the table to get in the door at all for traditional horror markets. And the good news is the majority of horror authors that I've seen have at least been, they've been welcoming of it. It seems to be not that the established status quo horror authors don't want the diversity. It seems to be on the publishing side where it's really falling down still, and hopefully that changes.
Any thoughts, Chris?
No, I think that Hillary and Sarah have covered it. I think that
Chris in the hot seat.
Yeah, no. I think it is changing, and I think it's going to change. It's interesting to me. What I'm hearing is that these kinds of sort of thrillers that Sarah, you were talking about, that it's getting harder and harder for men to sell. And, let me be careful what I'm saying here, that it's getting harder and harder for male authors to come in fresh with those kinds of stories because they're now beginning to be perceived as women's stories, which is fascinating. So you look at somebody like Sarah Pinborough breaking through with Behind Her Eyes. And if a male author now tried to pitch an original book like that, it would be harder in that case. But I think, Hillary, what you're saying about horror is 100% correct. And that's a thing that the business needs to work on, because those stories are more interesting. The stories that we haven't read 100 times. When Jim Moore and I recently edited the Twisted Book of Shadows, and what we kept saying is, we don't want the stories that we've read 100 times. We don't want the middle-aged white guy goes back to his hometown and there's a haunting from his childhood that's still there, and and it comes back. We want something different, and I think that you're going to see the editors wanting the same.
Okay, so there is a quote here from Zigzag Claiborne, which I will put on screen before we go to wrap up. Marginalized people live horror as a matter of course. Their works should be required reading. Which also goes back to what I said earlier during the session, which is we watched The Handmaid's Tale and some of us are going, oh, look, that's my life on screen. And sadly, don't feel much horror because that's what happens in real life is even worse than what's on screen.
Well, that's what Atwood always says, is that she based all of the every single atrocity that she put in that book she got from someplace around the world that's happening, whenever when she wrote it. So
we have been here for about an hour and a half, and so it's time to wrap up. Just to remind everybody that we have the Read for Pixels fundraiser happening. And Christopher, Hillary, and Sarah have all donated goodies. Christopher's Ben Walker book bundle is long gone. Someone nabbed it. The moment it came out, like literally 5 minutes later, we get a notification going, the book is gone, the book bundle is gone. Sarah's Hex anthology about witches and witchery, that's gone too, but we still have 2 signed and personalized edition hardcover copies of Hillary's latest book, The Hollow Girl. And Hillary will send it to donors in the US. You make a donation, just scroll down the screen and click donate at the listing of Hillary's book. And Sarah has one more goodie. She will tuckerize one super generous donor in her upcoming book, Good Neighbors. That's definitely coming out next fall 2020. So you're definitely going to be, your name's going to be in front of everyone. I'm not sure whether Sarah is going to give you a really horribly creative death, but that's up to Sarah. You'd be surprised. A lot of people get tuckerizations because they want to see themselves horribly, creatively murdered on the page.
We're not surprised.
And also, this week is actually Brit Fantasy Week. So if you fancy goodies from some of the best British science fiction fantasy authors writing today, you're in for a treat, as we have all sorts of perks from Anna Smith Spark, Adrian Tchaikovsky, which he is providing in conjunction with Penn Macmillan UK, Juliet E. McKenna, Jen Williams, and Richard K. Morgan, who wrote Altered Carbon. Those are all up on our page. So I'm going to share. I'm going to do a little screen share, everybody, so you'll know where to go get these. Can everyone see this? Awesome. So you can go donate to get goodies at Rally Up, our platform Rally Up. You go to bit.ly/R4P Rally Up 2019. And we also have a special auction featuring some really rare books from horror maestro Stephen Graham Jones. Books so rare that you can't even get them on eBay. I'm not even kidding about this. We did our homework. Stephen also ran a search. You might be able to get 2 or 3 copies floating about Amazon, but not on eBay. And the auction is open until the 21st of September 2019. So you can go to bit.ly/SGJ Charity Auction 2019. And you can also find out more about the Read for Pixels program at bit.ly/Read for Pixels. It's all case sensitive. So make sure you get it down correctly. And Anushya will also cut and paste the links into the chat box if you just want to do a single click. So let's stop sharing here. Christopher, I think you have an announcement for Halloween season, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we have people come from all over the country for, we have had people come from out of the country for the Merrimack Valley Halloween Book Festival, which takes place in Haverhill, Massachusetts. It's the 5th annual festival this year on October 12th, Saturday. Hillary will be there. Sarah sadly will not, but has been there in the past. And we'll be debuting Hex Life, the anthology that Sarah's talking about. And it's an anthology that I co-edited with Rachel Autumn Deering. It's an anthology of witchcraft stories, and all of the contributors are women.
Yeah, and if anyone's interested, we are going to host Anna Smith Spark at 10 a.m. on Sunday, the 8th of September, which is tomorrow, and she'll be talking about violence against women in grimdark epic fantasy. So that's where you go if you want to rant about violence against women in grimdark, of which there are. It probably rivals horror for the volume of violence against women, actually, as a genre. So I guess it's time for all of us to say good day or good night wherever you are in the world. If you have any more questions, there are more sessions coming up, like I said, and you can ask authors there. So have a good day or good morning wherever you are. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.